Let's look at portraiture, faces, and some illustration techniques and inspirations that costume designers look to when we're moving beyond that figure sketch and illustrating the clothes, and ultimately moving it into describing texture, form, and color. Faces have similar rules of proportion that are not necessarily true from every individual to another, but can be relied upon for drawing purposes to basically plant eyes, nose, mouth, and so on in the right locations so that our characters look semi-realistic. Generally, we want to divide the face that's inscribed in some sort of an oval form in half, lengthwise and widthwise. The lower half we subdivide into either fifths or thirds. There are a few different models. On the left here we can see fifths. I'll show you an example with thirds later. You place the eyes sitting just above that halfway latitude line. Think about it like the equator. And then the mouth and nose are placed on that center longitude line. The mouth is about 2/3 of the way down from the eye line. And the nose sits just below 1/3 below the eye line, at least the shadow portion. Those are the primary landmarks that we place, and we'll look at a few different formulas that you can use and that artists have used particularly since the classical era. But once you've placed eyes, nose, and mouth, and yes, nose and mouth can be simple shadow lines and shadow shapes, then you very quickly want to indicate the location of the hair, especially in our sketches where that's a very important storytelling device, and then note any places that you're going to have to make makeup suggestions. The example on the right similarly shows you the longitude and latitude lines, the location of the eyes, the set of the lips, the placement of nose. Note that the eyes themselves, you usually divide that eye line, that horizontal line, into fifths. And the eyes themselves are the unit of measurement that goes across. So across from temple to temple, we have 5 eyes in width, and the eyes are placed 1 eye apart off of the center line if you look at the top right. And then you can also see an illustration on the lower right of the basic sphere for skull with this extended tapered box for jawline that we can use to build up a face if it's off front. So if we're looking at something that's a 3/4 view, for instance. Here's an example where you can construct a face full front with a circle, a smaller circle, and then adjoining lines that taper towards the lower jaw area, divided on the eye line into fifths, which will tell us where the eye placement would be, and that lower circle then divided off of its own center point into thirds. And so from this diagram, which is actually a more precise accounting, you already have placement for all of the landmarks. So if you go over into the upper right, you'll see the placement of the eyes on that eye line. They're in the 2nd and 4th spots in the units of 5 that define the eye line. And then the location of nose, where those on the line where the top sphere ends, and the lips are placed in that central demarcation. This is all from actually a really nifty book by an old school illustrator named Jack Ham. So if they look kind of retro, that's why, but these are really classic illustration techniques that are very useful to us because most of them can be accomplished with really simple and efficient pencil strokes. But I recommend this book for costume designers. It's an inexpensive, like I think $9 to $12 expense. And it's one that will be useful for just your practice and your life. So it also gives you different kind of sample eye shapes, brow shapes, lip sets, and some really recognizable pencil techniques to accomplish them. Here's another method from the same text about constructing a face from yet more geometric pattern inspirations. So the hidden angle method at the top, where it's all about the tapering lines that triangulate towards that Cupid's bow above the mouth. The hidden circle technique, where it's all built through these overlapping arcs. and then the kite method, that's sort of a knockoff from the hidden angles, that takes the central point up to the meeting point where the nose tapers between the eyes. So these are things that like old school cartoonists from like the 1940s and even 30s, they used these to define different like sweetheart faces or villain faces and things like that. So they are cartoony in nature. And they might have used the more angular variation to describe, a mysterious damsel, or the rounded shapes to define somebody who they considered to be more of an ingenue. And yes, they are stereotypical in their caricatures, but again, we are in the business of designing characters. And so these are useful tools for us. But just to show you that if you don't see bodies and the world in ovals, that's okay, right? There are different ways to simplify the planes of a face. And these triangulated forms actually help you see different shadow planes. So particularly for makeup purposes, it's useful because the planes of the cheek, for instance, are described, and they do imply a certain amount of kind of forward movement. Let's go ahead and do a simple face layout. I'm just going to use pencil here, and I'm going to start with a simple basic oval shape. I'm drawing this much larger than I would for a costume sketch. Okay, so we've got a basic oval laid out. So I'm going to go ahead and divide it in half, up and down, and side to side. I'm just freehanding it. You'll notice there's no ruler involved here, like laying out an overall body proportion. So normally in a costume sketch, the head is somewhere more in this scale over here, right? So we're just, even in our basic sketch, laying out some simple orbital lines. This is much larger. So from here, I'm going to divide, the proportion I usually default to is the one where we divide the bottom half into thirds, like so, more or less. And then we divide the top half also into thirds, more or less. So I plant my eyes. I usually make mine sit slightly above the half line, actually. I'll map them in, but then I'm going to go ahead and, after I've laid in a basic almond shape. So if you'll recall, there's the whole dividing this line into 5 units from side to side so that we space I. So I'll correct what I mapped in freehand, and I'll extend my eyes over a little bit more towards the center in both cases. So I usually place my eyes sitting slightly above that halfway line. The nose lives between the eyes, and the nose, I plant my nose, the bridge kind of coming down here, and then I'll usually have my nostrils floating just below. And so I'll just kind of gesture in some shapes there. Mouth I can plant in with a couple circles on that center line, and I'll place it down here on this lowest third. I will plant my eyebrows up above. I'll just gesture in a line right now that's going to sit up closer to this mark. I'm sitting mine just below it. And then I'll usually let my hairline fall somewhere in here at this top third. So I'll go ahead and let's give her a middle part. Why not? With some strands that I'll gesture in. Ears live between the eyes and attach around the nose attachment point at the bottom where the nostrils are. So I'll gesture in a shape there. So I've just mapped in shapes. So in a costume sketch, I might very well, if I go over to this smaller one, I might just give myself that halfway line, and I might give myself a shape here for eyes, gesture and eyebrows to start, and gesture on a mouth placement line in my rough sketch stage. Ears are important. Same thing. Let's give her a center part. I've placed her longitude line that goes up and down a little bit to the side. So this one already has a sideways glance aspect. I'll worry about little by little kind of sculpting out the face more carefully. But to begin with, I'll just put her in there. Let me give them a neck as well. So let's go back to this one. So for a traditional costume sketch, we don't actually worry a lot about eyes because they're very, very small. So we can lean even on sort of anime and cartoon kind of tropes about eye placement. And we don't have to get into anything remotely like an iris. But we did a sketch earlier when we were looking at hair, right, where you saw how I mapped in eyes. I draw fairly big eyes. We all have a propensity in one direction or another, and that's certainly mine. I'll carve out a little eye duct shape in the center. Generally, there's a little overhang shadow that's created from the upper eyelid. It's not even eyelashes, it's just literally a cast shadow that we actually see. And I'm going to just quickly kind of cartoon in some brows and then keep going back in and isolating further information. I'll give them a little bit of an eyelid, not a strong one. And let's give it a little bit more cast shadow at the base of the nostril, because that's actually most of what we see when we look at a face is this, these dark caverns down here that are actually the most prominent parts of the face. And then with the mouth, similarly, like what we actually make out the most of is the set of the lips, which I'll go ahead and mock in there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and kind of gray in the upper lip and give a little more cast shadow around here, as well as to the dent that it would cast shadow down onto the chin. Carve out a little bit more of a jaw. And give them a little bit of a cheekbone. You notice I'm kind of bouncing to different parts, right, of information, because it's not a portrait, it's a getting down information about hair, makeup, brows, the things we can actually control. So when we do a costume sketch, for instance, I'll go back to the smaller one. I mean, what we are primarily interested in is information that would tell us how hair and makeup might approach the character. This character over here has a far stronger brow than my friend over here. I'll come back to this one. But similarly, even in a smaller scale, I actually wouldn't even spend this much time on a face on a costume sketch, but for the sake of conversation, right? And demonstration. And actually, if this is pointing off to the side, we wouldn't see that ear over there. I'm going to go ahead and give them some braids, actually. One thing that is also a good note about faces, so I tend to draw necks quite narrow, it's a thing, and you'll see it in my sketches, along with, I think I already pointed out, particularly curvy calves, but neck thickness is something that's related to testosterone and estrogen. So in children and adolescents who haven't reached puberty, they almost always have necks that are narrower than their jawline at its widest point. But once people hit puberty, and sort of in that time period between, say like age 12 and 23, to be honest, there's this kind of balancing of hormones that takes place. So people who have more testosterone in their system, by the time they are, let's say, 21 to 23 years old, their necks will be as wide as their jawbone. People who have less testosterone in their system and more of an estrogen balance in their system will in fact have, it's the glands in fact are sort of less inflated, and they will appear to have a narrower neck than their jawbone. So that's also something just in terms of our character descriptions that we do in a sketch that we might want to pay attention to. So this person has more of an estrogen influenced neck. So I might leave her there. Again, she has some big eyes. I'll go ahead and give her some pupils so she doesn't look completely satanic. And I'll leave her there. So in a costume sketch, I might very well go ahead and suggest some amount of shadow and modeling at this stage, but I would actually save most of that for working with either a gray Pantone marker or a really loose wet watercolor wash that would go either underneath the skin tone or on top at the very end. So I wouldn't necessarily put in a bunch of shadow and detail with pencil. I would put in primary lines, essential shapes, and maybe suggest and gesture in basic places where I'm going to have a lot of shadow. So yeah, I wouldn't even necessarily go in as much as I'm going in right now to tell about this form, because paint can in fact do that much more quickly. All right, I'm going to leave it at there. As you can see, all of us have a propensity to overwork, but in truth, in any kind of sketch at this point for what I do, I would switch over to illustration techniques and to mixed media. And we'll talk more about that as well, but I would basically add in either light gray marker shadowing or soft, similarly kind of blue, lavender, gray shadows in watercolor, and then proceed with skin tone and additional hair coloration.